Once the binding has figured out what the source object is, the next thing it needs to know is where to go on that source object to obtain the value it's going to use to set the target property. And that's where property paths come in. The path property on a binding is what determines the property path. Typically, it's going to be a simple value, but it could be a complex path. Basically, the path to the binding can be passed one of two ways. If you use the syntax on the left, which we've seen a number of times, where we just say binding and name, you're actually calling a parameterized constructor on the binding markup extension object. And that name gets passed into the parameterized constructor and is used under the covers to set the path property. The alternate way is to use the path equals name syntax, in which case you're actually calling the default constructor of the binding and then setting the path property explicitly after construction. Either way, the net result is exactly the same. The binding object is created and the path property is set to name. Now, bindings are typically set to just a simple path, a property name on the source object itself. So if your source object is a customer and you want to grab the name value off that customer, you just say path equals name. They can also be complex paths and walk an entire object graph from the source object. So if your source object is, say, the window, and the window exposes a customer, then your path may be customer, and then dot down into the orders collection of that customer, index into that array, and get a single object out of the orders, in this case the second one in the array. Then the order object that you obtain can have a collection of order details, so we can dot down to that. We could reach into that collection and grab out the third object from the order details collection. On that order detail object, it may have a product related object. We can dot down to that, and then finally dot down to the name. Once we get down to a discrete value that we're trying to set through our binding, we're ready to go. You can also have no path at all. So you can basically let the binding say, give me the whole source object. And we've seen a couple of these in previous demos as well. You can express this with just binding and no arguments whatsoever. And you're basically saying path equals dot is the equivalent syntax. Dot meaning the current object, similar to a file system path. Now, an important concept related to binding paths is how you go about debugging bindings that are not working for you. Basically, you want to always be paying attention to the output window when you're hooking up data binding and trying to get it working. If you have an error in one of your bindings, particularly the path is incorrect, what you're going to get is some information dumped to the output window. And it looks kind of like this. You can either have data warnings or data errors, and it's going to tell you detailed information, including what property was not found on what source object, in this case IDX and customer. And then it's also going to tell you what the target element property and type is as well. So this is something you can stare at and then go inspect those objects and figure out whether you've actually got something that should be working. By default, Visual Studio is going to show both warnings and errors. If you want to only show errors, which are the more severe form, you can go through Tools Options, and there's a place under the debugging section where you can change the data binding WPF trace settings. So let's take a look at property paths and debugging in a demo.